Good morning. We are here on the fifth and last day of the sixth forum of development developed by ABDE. We are having very important debates on regional cases and exchanging experiences with colleagues from all over the world. Today, we're going to talk about the transitions in the Brazilian economy. We're going to have some governors and also cooperation agencies. We are having this event being broadcast live. We have translation into English and Spanish, and the videos with this forum will be available on YouTube as of next week. We have an official hashtag for our forum, hashtag Fórum do Desenvolvimento. Very well, we are going to go to our first activity of the day. Thank you, Adalgisa, for the introduction.
Muito bem, ao longo do Fórum do Desenvolvimento.
Along the Development Forum, we have a fishbowl on regulation, innovative instruments, and also partnerships for development. Today, our guests will debate the Brazilian economy in transition. And so we would like to invite for this conversation Lavínia from BNDES, Julia Braga of the Fluminense University, Federal University, Rafael from the Minas Gerais University, José Roberto Afonso of the Brasilia Institute for Public Development, and Luiz Esteves from the Bank of Northeast, and Sávio Caçador of the Development Bank of Espírito Santo, and Luciano Schweizer of the Inter-American Bank for Development. And now I'll give the floor. I'd like to welcome you, Lavínia Castro. Good morning. Thank you, Adalgisa, for your introduction. Good morning. It is an honor, and I'm very pleased to be here participating in ABDE Forum. I'd like to thank Sergio Guzmão for the invitation, and also to congratulate all of you who are working in the organization of this event. So many of you who are working in the production. Thank you for such an important seminar for the development system carried out in such a difficult moment for our country and in the middle of a pandemic. We are going to divide this panel into two blocks. The first block will address industry and employment, and the second will address infrastructure and macroeconomic conditions for resumption. We are going to have two speakers who will speak for 10 minutes. Then we are going to have debaters speaking for 5 minutes, and then there will be answers taking 2 minutes each speaker. So I'd like to invite Carlos Pinkusfeld, José Roberto Afonso, and as a debater, Luciano Schweizer and Sávio Caçador. Good morning. So I'd like to invite Professor Carlos Pinkusfeld to speak to us about macroeconomics outlook and the structural challenges of the Brazilian economy. Thank you. I will share a presentation. Thank you, Lavínia. Thank you, ABDE, for the invitation. I'd like to speak about... Here we are. Can you see my presentation? Yes. Okay. So, the title of my presentation is Brazil in a World in Transition, but it is certainly a world in transition. So I adjusted the title. So there is no doubt that the world is in a transition. It is multipolar, geo-economic, geopolitical, whether we want it or not. It is also going through a technological transition, quite relevant. It's an energy transition as well, the standard of energy, etc. There's a lot of dynamism in the world. The problem is that we are not very dynamic here. This is a projection I'd like to share with you. If we look at an optimistic scenario, the per capita income of Brazil was stopped for or stagnated for 13 years. In my projection, I'm talking 18 years for us to go back to where we were before. So this terrible performance shows that we are not doing well. Since 2014 to 19, we was ranked 180 in 194 countries, and some of them are in war. So we are in a situation that is not positive. In a transitioning world, we are not doing well. And I said I was going to speak about industry. So our industrial production are shown here in this graph, 2014, and these are the peaks. And we also have declines. So we have capital goods, we have intermediate goods, we have durable consumption goods. So we are not well again, 5th or 10th in some sectors, behind the peak of 7 years ago. So we are worse than we were, much worse than we were 7 years ago. So in services, we're not doing that much better regarding the previous peak. But it is seasonal. December, we're 11% under the peak of December 2014. It is important to say that there is a sector that helps us, communication, especially because of the pandemics, but we're still doing badly. We had a retrocess, and in a transitioning world that requires for fast change. But we have not always been like this. This graph shows us in relation to other countries in Latin America. Until 1930, we used to be very poor, and then we can see now our performance in comparison with Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Uruguay. So we did quite well for quite a period. And here, obviously, we're growing very little because of regrettable decisions at the domestic scenario, but we are even worse. As you can see, I don't know if you can see, there's the blue line with current transactions. This graph shows in red the GDP variation, and there's a green line that there is a breakage, a small decline there in the middle in green. So we worsened economic growth, and we also worsened in current transactions. It should be the opposite, right? So after 2009, we can see a very bad structural decline. This is a restriction to growth. If we want to grow, we cannot continue like this.
And as Lavínia mentioned, this is related to the industry, our performance here with this, as this EED data shows, we have high technology, medium technology, low technology industry. And so in the transformation industry, there was a small surplus that dropped after 2009 and up to 2015, because I didn't want to get into the acute recession after 2015. And so this phase, with this negative transition in Brazil, there is a huge deficit of high technology industries and medium and high technology and even medium to low technology. And so a big gap, a hole, a drop in current transactions as measured by our industry at a transition moment from 2008, 2009 was a transition point with significant deterioration of industrial performance with strong impact externally and on the demand side, as well as external restrictions, which were considerably worsened. And so it's really bad in these two senses. I'm not going to be repeating this, but of course we have to resume industrial growth, because that's where you have generalized productivity gains and intra and intersectoral relationships and innovation for other sectors and production of goods with more income elasticity and, well, the deterioration of exchange. So there is an inversion here in relation to exchange, but there is here this issue of income elasticity. And these are sectors that involve energy transition, artificial intelligence, and that we should try to be on board. And so some interesting results. Any methodology, there's the discussion on deindustrialization and delays and so on, but in recent work by Mocedo and Bassoni, showing that when there was a growth of the economy, well, there wasn't a deindustrialization. And so what I mean to say is that it's fundamental to resume growth. There's no innovation in terms of purchasing of new machines. Well, you can give it up. There were many industrial policies, 2004, 2008, 2011, but the results were not what was expected. And so we should look at these unsuccessful or policies with less results than expected before formulating future policies. But this is a world, a completely different world. And so we are in a transition towards IoT and 4.0 industry, energy transition, artificial intelligence, etc. But this is occurring. Well, currently we're moving back. And in a world of global or regional value chains, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but this renews the problem. So if you think you're going to get into these chains from the bottom, we don't have competitiveness in Brazil for this. And if we want to get into it from the top, we are too far back in terms of development technology, etc., and several other issues that I'm going to point out now. So is the homework being done? Are we doing our homework? Scarce perspective of vigorous resumption of the economy. There's no reasonable scenario showing that we are going to return to strong economic growth. Without that, we cannot have any industrial acceleration or renovation of the industrial hub without this. And so we need to grow again. We had some experiences with industrial policies that were reasonable, but there's no clear signaling that of industrial policy. And so that's another issue that we'll have to tackle if we want to move into this modern world. It's the issue of value chains will have to be negotiated with we have an interesting geopolitical position in a multipolar world. We are part of the BRICS. We are close to the US. Getúlio Vargas taught us how to do this, of course, in a more tense environment at the time of war. But we also have scale, we have size, we have economic interest in participating and becoming a big domestic market. And with that, we can try to expand. So, finally, in order to do this complex combination of economic growth leading to industrial modernization and bringing to Brazil a negotiated entry of value chains into sectors that might bring about some absolute advantage or perhaps geopolitical or geoeconomic leverage with China, with the United States, which in turn will have to be combined with some degree of industrial policy, some sectoral direction or targeting. But that requires infrastructure growth, because this technological change will be done with a big change, a significant change in telecommunications, in transport. We need you to conclude, please. So how to do this with cuts expenditures. So we are not doing 1, 2, or 3, and we're failing in 4. The last graph, with this degree of public investment and brutal drop in relation to previous years that were not that spectacular, we're not going anywhere. So we have a lot of homework to do in order to try to position ourselves more positively in this global transition. Thank you. You've shown us very interesting data and concerning issues. I have to move directly to our next debater, our next presenter, José Roberto. It's a pleasure to have you with us. So we've just shown the industry and its relevance for employment. Now we'll move on to the importance of the agenda of development banks in face of the worsening of employment data and conjunctural and structural issues affected by the pandemic. Thank you. I'd like to greet you and the other colleagues participating in the session. As Carlos said, we are facing a huge challenge, not only in terms of conjuncture, but also in terms of structure. And in view of the calamity that we are experiencing in all senses, especially the human tragedy, we have a unique opportunity to make changes that can lead us to a new world. Families, even companies, have already made changes. It's the government that hasn't, or some governments haven't, and public policies have not yet been adapted to the new reality. The main point here is that the pandemic, we are not going back to what we had before. It's no use targeting recovery. We need to target reconstruction. That is the inspiration for Biden's plan in the US and also the European discussion and plan. And as you said, employment and labor are no longer synonyms. In the past, Keynes, perhaps, Keynes with his theory of employment and the construction of a welfare state focusing on employment and salary. And then you have public development policies targeting employment in terms of formal employment. Before the coronavirus, we already had a dilemma, a succession of crises which were quite severe in Brazil. The virus arrived in Brazil before a full recovery from the 2014 recession. We hadn't even returned to the 2008 levels, as Carlos showed us. And so there are two structural elements that to be added there. Automation, which is irreversible, which initially destroys employment. It can generate new employment, new jobs, but this depends on public policies mostly for reskilling and in order to cater to new demands. And so, for instance, we have a shortage of data scientists in Brazil and around the world.
The other trend is of independent work, especially among youth. Most youth don't want to have a fixed job where they have to go to. And all this impacts on the public side, especially financing of public policies that are based on jobs and salaries, especially Social Security. We need to find, in this sense of challenges, generating jobs and employment, but also reconstructing public policy. And in this context, in my opinion, development banks play an essential role. Of course, they need to continue with everything they used to do before, but we will need to find jobs, but also we have 17 million companies in Brazil. I don't think we have anything like that in the world. Many entrepreneurs left registered work because they lost their jobs and they can't find any other, and now they are in entrepreneurship. So the development banks reconcile social and economic development. Not just now, but before the pandemics, they already had this role. So in Brazil, we sometimes think there is a dichotomy between private markets and development banks. I mean, only in Brazil we see it like that. It's not like that anywhere else in the world. We have seen even movements of the creation of private development banks. I confess I had not had time to delve into it. So it has this broad vision of reconstruction as a development bank. But even more developed economies and the most liberal economies that didn't used to have development banks, such as the US and the UK, did create development banks. I live here in Portugal, and after some decades, in Portugal also created its development bank. In Europe, we have the Bank for Reconstruction and the Bank of Development. So these banks have been crucial to supply with liquidity the market when the central banks did not do that directly or by governments. And very often this involved the action of development banks, reconciling resilience and reconstruction. Resilience as in surviving the crisis, and reconstruction as a new type of living, with new foundations. Until November last year, $480 billion were involved with development banks, and the KfW alone injected 100 billion euros. Countries that had their own used them, and those who didn't have one created one. Brazil, I believe, is a single case of a country that had its own development bank, and it did not use it as a key player in the combat to the pandemics. I think it doesn't have a strategy. Some people even don't think there is a pandemic in Brazil. It's just a code. So reality imposes itself. It is greater than any opinion. And now we have an agenda. We are far from leaving the crisis. Actually, investment in public health are crucial for us to leave this crisis. It's obvious. But public health in Brazil is a sector that leverages a lot of work and jobs. In the health sector, we have a huge impact in the economy. There is a work published by Fiocruz, by the Celso Furtado Center, showed all the potential around that. And in my opinion, development banks should focus on that as well. Reconciling health with their mandates. In Brazil, there was a moment when there was the economy was stopped, was stagnated, and at the same time we had other parts of industry that was also stopped. So we do need reconstruction that will be more digital, will be greener, and it will be more social. In particular, the Brazilian arrangement, which is the FAT, which is the Fund to Support Workers. But it is only for employed people. We need to create this fund and an insurance policy to cater for other types of workers that are not registered workers. So we can also use that fund in the generation of development by the BNDES, and at the same time, it has a cyclical kind of role, combining fiscal responsibility with economic and social responsibility. And it can be expanded to be not only a fund for PIS/PASEP, but covering the whole of social security and having greater articulation and liaison with the private sector. So both the FAT and the development banks will have to play a major role, whether we want it or not, in the inevitable reconstruction that we will have to do in our economy and in our society. I'm sorry I was late. Thank you again for the opportunity. No. I just let you know, because so that you knew that you're getting close to your time. So I'll comment later, and I'll give the floor to debaters. It is a pleasure having you, Luciano Schweizer. Please, you have the floor. Thank you, Lavínia. It is a pleasure to share this panel with you, with all of you. So I have worked with Lavínia before, Professor Carlos, I watch you on YouTube videos, Professor Carlos, and obviously Professor José Roberto also. Long worker in development. As far as I heard, we are going through a moment of transition. We are like, we have just suffered an earthquake. And the good news that we had is that the development system are still standing and showed their relevance when the country faces very difficult situations. And the challenges are only starting. Another important point, it has to do with the capital markets. And
transactions continued happening, and the bets on in this area continued. As Zé Roberto mentioned regarding the public development banks, it's clear that there is a group of capital holders and that things are not doing well. We need to do something to change direction. Along these same lines, the bonds and sustainable investments are not reinforced by the same logic. And of course, the single health system is an asset that proved how important it is to be strengthened at times like this. Historically, these kinds of pandemics will repeat themselves. We can expect more of them. And so, Zé Roberto, addressing the industry in connection with health, it's very important to continue addressing this through multiple dimensions. For instance, there's the issue of the aging of the Brazilian population. On the other hand, companies and families seem to already have adjusted, and so the situation is given. And this will probably lead Brazil to changing its development axes. So I'd like to draw attention to the work led by Lavínia and an article published in December 2015, which is about working with scenarios. And so one of the scenarios that she mentions in the article is the world as a windmill, a mill. And so if we don't want to direct this transatlantic Brazil, this huge country, towards a very complex situation as described in the scenario, we should take some measures to prevent or to avoid and to correct the course of our country. Another important point mentioned by Professor Carlos is related to the regional blocks. So this is a movement in transition. They're moving. Brazil, always dependent on agribusiness as if success were guaranteed. I don't see it that way. I see important, significant investments made in Africa and in the east of Russia, in areas that are with ice melts. And so the world is going through a transition. It's important to understand this and reinforce again that we need to look at the future, look at the scenarios, and see how we're going to position ourselves in order not to be surprised, learning lessons from the past. And so I'll conclude my comments here, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in such a highly qualified panel. Thank you. Thank you for your contribution. I will give the floor to Sávio Caçador for his comments. Good morning, Lavínia and panel colleagues. Thank you once again to ABDE for the invitation to participate in this event since Monday. I am going to make a slightly different comment. José, Roberto, and Carlos are in a better position to talk about the current scenario in Brazil and in the world than myself, and so I am going to I'm going to take a slightly different stance. And so the discussions we've had along the week, we've been discussing these very strange times. We've been talking about development and cooperation and issues that are relevant. But perhaps today might be difficult to talk about these issues in such strange times. I'd like to reinforce the role of development banks, especially the subnational development entities. Experts claim that the main economic justification for the existence of a development institution is market deficiencies that affect the supply and demand of investments due to several issues: market power, external factors. Since development institutions are supported by the state and funded by the state, they do have a competitive advantage over private operators. And so they are better positioned to address market deficiencies. Their economic rationale is related to their capacity to facilitate financing, and where private operators don't operate for several reasons. That's why we understand that it's important for national and subnational development institutions to have regular funding in order to finance development. It might seem a bit heretic to say this nowadays, but particularly I don't see how you can develop without well-targeted resources and a clear policy and clear guidelines of where we want to arrive, what we want to achieve. Brazil might be a country with most experience, with more laboratories for industrial and regional policies. Some perhaps not as successful as other countries, but in my view, we actually haven't reviewed the results of these policies and made adjustments and corrected the course of such policies. So I'd like to present to you, to bring to you a proposal that was presented at ABDE at the end of 2017. It's a proposal that was presented by José Roberto Afonso, who on the occasion it was proposed as the development fund of the state. And so the goal of the proposal was to develop fiscal and financial modeling that would allow, in an innovative fashion, the regional development. And when we talk about regional, it's not only the classic traditional regional. We're talking about industrial policy, scientific and technological policy. All this is included with strategic repositioning of the development institutions, especially at the regional level. And so in a partnership between governments, between the federal government and the governments of each state, and exploitation of the capital market in order to resume growth and investment. So it's a proposal for the resumption of growth investment with a regional perspective. We know that in the past few years, some subnational development institutions have been addressing their funding problems, going to the market, issuing bonds, but this is a reality that unfortunately is limited to the bigger agencies. I'm not criticizing anyone here. Congratulations to them. They're doing a good job, but we know that many subnational institutions find it extremely difficult to, they lack the technical resources for this. And so what we propose is we want to resume this proposal so that all development institutions might have regular funding, allowing for a regional development policy at this time of crisis. We understand this is a very important instrument and alternative to this end. So I'd like to conclude and give the floor back to Lavínia. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Now I will speak before I give the floor back to panelists. So, yes, José Roberto is right, but as Luciano mentioned, the health sector has major interconnection with industry, in the pharma industry, in the supply of equipment. And I believe that out of the policies I mentioned in Brazil, that was one that had a good performance, even though it's not excellence. For example, in terms of pharmaceuticals. You are right. When I spoke about industry, and that was my subject, right? Industry is important, even if the final demand be generated by the service sector. So it will provide support, be it for pharmaceuticals or hospital equipment. So it is a dynamic area that should be taken into account. So I do agree totally. It is one of the development axes that we should take. And we need to use what we have in terms of advantage. We have a public sector that is right, that is large. We already have existing pharmaceutical industry that has some technological development, and we need to use these elements in order to leverage and be included in the new world in transition. There is a book with an article that I authored. It has to do with Biden, maybe the new Roosevelt, quote unquote, and the discussion of Roosevelt with Keynes. I addressed that because Keynes thought that Roosevelt was not very forward, and Roosevelt thought that Keynes was a bit, was into everything. So it was a bit like that in Bretton Woods as well. And why am I saying that? Because we have a bit of the Keynes position that people repeat, a dead economist. No, it is the opposite. Economists need to follow politicians. So in the US, we have the numbers of deaths. And if you compare the US and China, I mean, something had to be done, and it was done, and the economists follow, giving inputs and contributions. The idea is to indicate paths, but We can only change if there is a political change. We can help, but sometimes it's quite difficult. I don't know if it's good or bad. Thank you. José Roberto, you have the floor. Just to complement what Luciano mentioned, there are very strong changes of paradigm all over the world. I have seen major efforts of the IADB in terms of digitalization of the economy, which is another key factor. Once again, development banks should work on that as well, and doing the liaison and encouraging innovation, and on the other hand, coupling with the new needs and demands that emerge. And in the middle of that, training and capacity building. In particular, I believe that digitalization of public services, we spoke a bit about SUS, about the health sector. I would say that the whole of the Brazilian public administration is lagging behind. We used to be vanguard, and now we are lagging behind the rest of the world. It is good and bad. The good is that there is a lot to be done, and this can help. We could start with health, with the health sector, with our system. But public administration needs to be inside a mobile phone. And just doing that generates a lot of jobs and employment, it generates a lot of innovation, and the IADB has been doing quite a lot of that. And Sávio mentioned very well when he mentioned the importance of us tapping on to the opportunities of gathering expertise, more than the financial capacity, using the expertise of development banks of analyzing projects and making this in combination with the private sector. Some have liquidity but cannot deal with the long term, cannot analyze projects, and this pandemic brings us great opportunities. For example, the huge amount of savings. Yes, we know that crises end up leading to savings. Here in this crisis, people are precautionary, not only because they are afraid of being unemployed, but they are afraid of dying. And people cannot do things they used to do before, so they save. So savings are very high among Brazilian families. At the same time, we have the interest rates of the public debt is very low, and the result is, among other things, is that the middle class is going to the stock exchange in Brazil. So this reinforces liquidity. We have new players, fintechs, we have very large internet companies preparing to come to Brazil and in the rest of the world. What we need to do is to make good use of this funding that is allocated because of lack of options, and together with adequate public policies and using the expertise of development banks, we can use this opportunity to open financing of industry, as mentioned before. Yes, the industry in general, as well as the health sector, the car industry that could be manufacturing ambulances and etc. They are long-term projects, and they need financing that is long and stable. This is very serious in Brazil. We have spoken a lot about the changes of the indexes in Brazil for more stable indexes so that we improve investments. But we need to take this advantage of the excess savings brought by the pandemics, placing public and private sectors to finance and create new opportunities for investment and development in Brazil. Thank you, Lavínia.
Thank you. Have many elements, and so very quickly, before moving on to the second block, Professor Carlos gave us a very interesting overview. We are used to looking at Brazil in relation to GDP and the US, and he showed our performance compared to other Latin American countries. Also, external restriction, which is the object of his work, and also the industry, showing how technological intensity, loss of high and medium technology industries is leading to a drop in our current transactions. And so this is a very important issue. And he has addressed industry as fundamental for productivity gain, for intersectoral relations, demand, generation of innovation, production of goods with greater income elasticity, all very interesting elements for our discussion. And this is related to our role as development banks in leading this very intensive recovery, technology-intensive recovery. And so, comments, Luciano's comments, thank you for reminding us of the scenarios. And so this is what scenarios should do. It's not about predicting, it's looking at trends and taking a position and acting to avoid future problems and drive more promising futures. That's the objective of scenarios, and thank you for mentioning this. Now, some comments on Professor José Roberto's presentation. So he addressed the renewal of development banks in the world. Given the challenges, the issue of employment, the future of employment, we don't want employment, we want skilled employment, decent employment, no development without employment. And he also addressed issues related to financing, FAT and the amount of resources. Over 500 executives of the BNDES signed a letter on the importance of the FAT, and in order to also warning about a reduction in the amount of financing, and these are resources that would generate more than 7 million jobs. Of course, we need other instruments, all sorts of bonds, and well, this is one path. It's very important, and all development banks are headed towards this. And there's also the issue of the fact that at times of crisis, resources disappear, and we need institutional mechanisms to guarantee long-term financing. Sávio mentioned the subnational banks and the infrastructure and technology work. We need well-directed, well-targeted resources also. And so moving to the infrastructure block. Thank you to all the speakers, and I'd like to invite Professor Júlia Braga. Professor also Professor Rafael Ribeiro to discuss infrastructure. And the commentators are Adauto, Modesto, and Luiz Esteves. I'll give the floor first to Rafael Ribeiro, who will talk about infrastructure, and also the connection between infrastructure and poverty, and also highlighting regional aspects of the development system. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to share a presentation. Meanwhile, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to participate in this panel.
Bom, deixa eu compartilhar aqui rapidamente. Acredito que todos já estejam vendo.
I believe you can all see the presentation.
Vou marcar o meu tempo aqui também. Bom, a minha apresentação é sobre
My presentation
tá? Sobre o papel
introduces some
infraestrutura para o desenvolvimento.
thoughts about the role of infrastructure for economic development. And it's connected to a very strong research line that we have here at the Regional Development and Planning Center of the University of Minas Gerais. I'd like to start by making a link with the previous speakers, Carlos and José, how external restriction, which is a bottleneck that hinders growth in the country and is associated with a drop in the degree of productive sophistication, this is strongly connected to several other factors, one of which I'd like to draw your attention to: the low level of investments, the drop in infrastructure investments that we've observed in the past few years in Brazil. So, if there is a hindering of growth on the demand side, we export increasingly less sophisticated products with added value. This is due to strong limitations also in terms of supply of infrastructure, generating bottlenecks for the productive sector and hindering companies from advancing in the production of more sophisticated goods. So, take, for instance, the electricity sector in Brazil, which is completely deteriorated. A small growth in this sector, this puts pressure on the electricity sector, creates a bottleneck also in the infrastructure. And so this graph shows that in 2014, right after we lost the game to Germany, the championship to Germany, we've had strong fiscal restriction and adjustment. 2016, we had the expenditure ceiling, and so we see a drop of public investment, much higher drop than in private investment. So from 2014 to 2019, a drop in public investment of 52% and in private investment 17%. And so we have insufficient infrastructure to deal with productive bottlenecks in the Brazilian system. Professor Carlos has already made a long presentation a detailed presentation on the critical situation of Brazil and tragic situation of Brazil. Obviously, after the pandemic, beyond the pandemic, there are other challenges to resuming growth. It's a situation that has been worsened by the pandemic. I will quickly make a cost-benefit analysis in general, analyzing the benefits of infrastructure, both from the point of view of economic growth, the better-known ones. And so we have increased productivity of companies, favoring maintenance and durability of private capital. So if you have good quality of the supply of infrastructure services, this allows companies to spend less with replacement and maintenance of all sorts of equipment, also greater durability of vehicles on roads, for instance. And so you spend less, the private sector spends less with the maintenance of capital. There's a reduction in transportation and logistics costs, positive impacts on health and education of workers, increasing productivity of labor, and there are also scale and scope economies, because investments in energy, telecommunications, and transport, they facilitate technological innovation and access of companies to new markets, driving economic growth. Now, one aspect that is less discussed is the positive impact of supply of infrastructure on reduction of poverty and income inequality. So it's a factor that needs to be added in the infrastructure investment analysis in terms of sustainable growth. When we talk about sustainable growth, we are speaking not only from an environmental sustainability point of view, but also social sustainability. And this should be a concern also when we assess infrastructure investments. Literature shows, in general, that infrastructure investments tend to generate better prospects of salary gains by increasing labor productivity, thereby reducing poverty and inequality. Also, the supply of infrastructure tends to increase the productivity of companies, thereby the goods and generating drops in the prices and favoring or benefiting workers with increased purchasing power. The infrastructure investments, they reduce the cost of energy, communications, and roads, and with the reduction of cost of living, this also increases the well-being of the population and poverty levels. Greater access to basic services such as water, sanitation, and solid waste treatment tends to reduce poverty in more multidimensional levels. It's not only about giving more income to the poor, but it's lifting the poor from a situation of little political power. And so this kind of supply is also very important in reducing poverty and inequality. Another aspect that needs to be considered,
especially when we talk about financing at the regional level, is to consider that infrastructure takes place in the space. So discussions about the geographic area and the spatial side of things is quite large. So infrastructure investment affects the decision about the localization of agents, where things are, where agents are, etc. So there is a trade-off between efficiency and equity at the space level. And literature shows that investment in roads in central areas and in poorer areas can generate greater economic growth, but it also ends up by bringing about inequality because of the search for larger markets. Obviously, the opposite as well. Sometimes infrastructure or transportation investments in poorer regions end up favoring labor to larger or to richer areas. So there may be inequality among regions, and this should be considered. Of course, sometimes a growth in richer areas can bring poorer regions together. And sometimes we have a win-win situation where both gain. Telecommunication investments, for example, can favor a lot of a spin-off and generate growth in both regions. So at the regional level, we need to look at agglomeration and dispersion. Agglomeration, because when we invest in a region, we have companies being attracted to the investment in the region and makes them gain markets and efficiency. On the other hand, it also generates dispersion, both regarding labor and rent. So this regional scope needs to be evaluated when we consider infrastructure investment. And this is a cost-benefit analysis And in terms of cost, investments in infrastructure are not financially neutral. They can generate significant costs, both because of the increasing competition for private credit and for the increase of taxes. And the benefit is not necessarily positive, but literature shows that the return to infrastructure capital tends to be to bring significant bottlenecks in the productive sector as well.
Não, estou encerrando aqui. Bom, e aí, só para discutir rapidamente alguns entraves.
Well, there are some hindrances to infrastructure investment in Brazil. Low efficiency of the planning and execution of projects and the low level of development in the capital market because of several differences, and income inequality enters in this quite strongly. We also see the recent reduction in the participation of public financing in a moment of economic crisis, and also the low attraction of investment of a foreign development institutions. It's not active, and BNDES can help solve these bottlenecks. I believe that cost-benefit analysis is that we need to think that we want the good things but not the bad things. So we need the coordination of the state to minimize costs and to have the optimization without unsustainable discourses. Thank you. Thank you. Now, Julia, you have the floor. Thank you for the invitation, and I will share a presentation as well.
Bom, eu acredito que ela já tenha aparecido para vocês.
Can you see my presentation?
Agora sim, obrigada. Então, como já foi falado pelos outros panelistas,
as mentioned by speakers before me, Brazil has been in an unprecedented situation in the last decades that ended up affecting the stock of liquid net physical capital. And if we look at that, we can see that as of 2015, this capital stock was stable, stopped growing, opposite to what was happening since 1996. And there is depreciation that is higher in terms of the accumulation of the new capital stock with a light decline. So I'd like to start by saying that quite a lot have mentioned in the economic debate that Brazil is not the US, therefore it could not have an infrastructure investment plan as mentioned by President Biden. But Brazil is not the US, in fact, but Brazil is also not South Africa. And South Africa is planning, it has a planning for, and it has a 10-year investment plan, and Brazil has international reserves that are 7 times larger than those of South Africa. With much less, South Africa is doing much more. So I am not defending that international reserves should invest infrastructure investments, because macroeconomics does not work like that. But there is a freedom degree of freedom for the country to plan and incentivize investment in infrastructure. How could we then? Is it possible to make feasible this new agenda that is so necessary? How could we do that of investment in infrastructure? The first point is to direct or target a more progressive taxation. But this happens in the midterm, and there are limitations. In general, tax changes lead to an effect and do not continue growing a long time. One other point that has been mentioned often is to cut compulsory expenditure in an open space for discretionary spending. Well, it does have a recession bias, so it ends up reducing basic collection, tax collection, and it also has limits because some key sectors such as health, education, and the environment require also compulsory spending. Also, through currency, this is something that the central bank has no control, does not have this power to finance via currency because it depends on the demand for liquidity by the public. So the public debt may be, I believe, an important element to make feasible this development agenda.
So the transfer of federal public bonds are important for direct financing of public investments and also to support the development banks and to finance private companies or in partnership with the public sector, guaranteeing also purchasing power for families because Brazil is a big continent-sized country. It's necessary for domestic demand to be vigorous, and it's necessary to invest in the domestic market because demand ultimately is an element that will justify for companies the need to increase private capital. Without this support to families, it's not possible to find internal demand that will justify the need of for companies to increase private capital. On the other hand, I'd also like to mention, I know Professor José Alberto Afonso defends a limit for public debt, but I think first of all that it's very important to keep in mind that the Brazilian public debt is largely formed by committed operations, and this is part of the macroeconomic policy of the country. And so we see an increase in public debt in 2020, very much related to the increase in these kinds of policies in order to help the investment funds, and this has increased public debt. So it's not only the necessary expenditures to fight the epidemic directly, it was the action of the central bank as well. And so a very important measure, if we do want to make room in this public debt that is directed to investment and proper functioning of development banks, we need to go back to the discussion of the voluntary reserves so that the debt will not be so contaminated by operations that are common monetary policy operations. So the public debt Is it a limit for the new economic growth agenda? I think we do have room, although Brazil, well, the issue of elasticity was mentioned. So we do have some degree of freedom regarding external restrictions because of our volume of international reserves. So regarding the indicator or the rule for public debt, I think this has to be well thought of, because what would be the proper indicator? Gross debt is not the ideal one. It should be the net debt, because we need to consider assets, not only liabilities. And the net debt is considered by rating agencies in their evaluation as well. Also, the literature is showing changes, also changes regarding the share of debt in income, and so there's no consensus regarding this target. It may be restrictive, it may render unfeasible the process of economic growth and this investment plan that the country needs so badly. And we might observe to conclude that this indicator, when you do simulations, and the UFRJ Economics Institute has been working on this, and so this, when there is economic growth, there will be, well, this is not an indicator that will grow endlessly if there is an active policy to stimulate economic growth. So we need to resume economic planning. We need to, rather than imposing a limit for public debt, we should think that the government should be transparent vis-à-vis the private sector regarding the prospects for economic planning, enabling economic scenarios, and how economic scenarios will enable economic growth, and allowing for this improvement in public debt indicators. And so these are my considerations, and I think Brazil needs to resume economic planning. There are institutions, there is human capital at development banks. The staff of development banks are highly qualified, and they can act in this sense. And without an infrastructure investment plan, Brazil will be left behind. And so institutions, we do have the right institutions. We need to make the best of the human capital and resume economic planning in order to rebuild physical capital. And so I'd like to give the floor to the debaters. We are very short of time. I will ask you to be very brief. So, Adauto Modesto for his considerations. Thank you, Professor Julia. Good morning. Thank you, Lavínia, for moderating this panel. I'd first like to thank ABDE for the invitation and organizing this event. Also, as an economist, it's an honor to participate in such a high quality panel. In my comment, which will be very brief, I'd like to ask permission to go a little bit down, or a little bit, well, actually, to leave the more conceptual and theoretical aspects of development financing and get to more concrete everyday issues of those who are operating the process. And this is an attempt to find a bridge between the important discussions of this panel with what was discussed along the week regarding the role of development banks in this agenda. So I'll start with two figures, which are important to give you an idea of points that I will bring up later. First, it's a 2014 study that shows that in order to finance effectively the full implementation of the 2030 agenda, we need to mobilize additional resources to the amount of $2.5 to $3.5 trillion annually by 2030. In recent OECD work paper, they argument that at least 65% of the 169 targets of the SDGs will demand some level of articulation, coordination with local governments in order to be implemented effectively. And so in short, these two figures suggest that any robust strategy for investments capable of promoting reconstruction, using the term proposed by José Roberto Afonso, economic and sustainable and inclusive reconstruction post-pandemic, this will demand huge efforts in mobilizing public and private resources above what we have today, or under any metrics that we use. And obviously, we will need, in such a big country as Brazil, we need to reinforce the role of regional and local governments. And this last point has been well addressed by my colleague Sávio. So the development banks, they have a key role in this effort for mobilizing resources and for strengthening subnational entities, given the representativeness and capillarity that they have in Brazil. So beyond their classic function in direct financing of projects, the development banks have also contributed to channeling private resources at global scale, catering to local demands. I'd like to point out recent issuance of a sustainable bond. I think Luciano mentioned this. We issued such bond at the end of last year at BDMG. It's an instrument that is very interesting for providing, for supporting programs, sustainable programs, and so resources were raised for investment in projects here in the state of Minas Gerais with direct impact on the ground. The development banks have an increasing role in the structuring of projects, and certain municipalities have difficulty structuring quality projects that are bankable and a little capacity to attract partners for execution. And so the development banks can support the design of such projects. There are project structuring platforms for this purpose, and they have been also through this activity in mainstreaming better risk management, especially social environmental aspects that Professor Rafael mentioned at the end of his presentation. Lastly, I'd like to point out that there is an agenda we haven't referred to yet, but which is significant in a more robust recovery of investments, which is the regulatory framework or environment. Any infrastructure asset, whether from private or public resources, they need a sound regulatory framework to guarantee reasonable costs. And so if at the federal level, this is a big challenge, when we look at states and municipalities, the issue is even worse. And it's important to invest in institutional strengthening and capacity building of public servants. And so these are the points I wanted to bring to our debate. Thank you, Professor Rafael, Professor Julia. If they can comment this briefly, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are not going to have time, so I'd like to, well, unfortunately, I will have to conclude. Professor Luiz Esteves, thank you for addressing these issues here and making the bridge with development banks. First, I'd like to thank the invitation and congratulate the ABDE and participating in this panel with you. And I'm going to be very quick. I think that basically in terms of infrastructure, as already mentioned, we have a challenge of reconstruction. And today the plan that we have, I'm not saying it's my plan, it's the plan on the table, which is basically investment will need to be mostly private. Public expenditures are subject to fiscal consolidation. It's not the state that will operate or exercise any leadership in reconstruction. Some aspects here, I don't remember in history that this has ever been done, a reconstruction at the level that will be required, with mostly private resources and the state basically with very small participation. I don't remember any time in history anyone has done this, and I hope we are lucky. One point is, what are the mechanisms? What is going to allow this? One point, the interest rate has never been so low, and a certain degree of liquidity. The 2 points here, 2 points that I'm going to mention. First, there's a lot of confusion between high and low risk. Another thing is not having any idea of what the risk is. If you don't have any idea of what the risk is, a high or low interest rate is completely irrelevant if you have no awareness of the risk. And so much of the infrastructure that we will have to rebuild, this has never been done before by the private sector. I once heard someone, an expert, BNB doesn't need to invest, is not supposed to invest in solar energy because the private sector does this. That's one point. Today, the private sector does this because today the private sector is able to price the risk, calculate the price of this. In the past, when the risk was unknown, it was mostly BNDES and BNB that did this. And so we actually tested the waters, and we look back and say, okay, it's safe.
After the risk has a price, then the challenge is easier. The challenge now is that those who are not used to investing in this learning curve and learning how to set price on the risk will have to do that now. Now, another thing is we are going to have to learn other things too. We know that we always had success with microcredit. It is tacit knowledge. We don't know exactly how you got there, but some of this knowledge is just there. So maybe it is never going to go to the private sector. So these are essential points. One, risk is not given. Does not fall from heavens. We need to set prices in a learning curve. And second, maybe we cannot pass this on to the private sector in a more sophisticated manner and structured manner. Thank you. I'm sorry I exceeded my time. It is a shame we have to finish many interesting things. I am sorry that I will not be able to give the floor back to the speakers. And we have seen that there is a robust infrastructure cycle, sanitation, mobility, telecom, but we still have 2.2% of GDP, so it's not enough to close our infrastructure gap. So we need to strengthen our investment projects, macro, the regulatory framework, etc. And thank you for you who spoke about poverty and inequality. Unfortunately, we will need to conclude. And thank you about talking about being bold, Luiz Esteves. It was a very good panel. I am very sad we're going to have to conclude without final remarks by you. But thank you all very much. Adauto, thank you too for conducting our panels, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Muito bem, Lavínia, nós é que agradecemos.
Thank you, Lavínia. We would like to thank the participants. The fact is that the topic is very relevant, very much valued by your participation. And thank you again. Of course, we did not have time for so many things and speaking everything at once about the transition of the Brazilian company. It is interesting to say that this is a starting point for other conversations. So our next activity now.
Muito bem, tomando o assunto agora é o futuro do desenvolvimento do Brasil.
Subject now is the future of development in Brazil. In the sequence, we're going to hear the speakers. Our next speakers are going to be some governors, state governors, I beg your pardon. So thank you, Sérgio Guzmão, for the invitation, and it is a pleasure being here in this virtual event. So thank you for the invitation, for me to participate. The very important event for the development agenda and for the economic development of our country. As we all know, since last year, we left normality, or so-called normality, and we went into a spiral of difficulties in the area, in several areas, social, political, especially sanitary. Since then, nothing in our country is dissociated from this pandemic. It has been a lot of grief, pain, with thousands of lives lost. And the losses in terms of social losses as well as thinking about the world that we want at the present with a view to the future. The state has never been so necessary in order to ensure the basic rights of society. And we are all aware of that, I believe. Speaking specifically of our management, of our administration, one of our main concerns when we looked at a very serious health problem was to tap on tools and help that could minimally support our small entrepreneurs, formal or informal, those who have more difficulty having access to credit. Through our microcredit program, we used our development agency of our state called the AGN, and we are helping small entrepreneurs to go through this crisis during this moment of restriction in activities so that they can gain some time to reinvent themselves. And we have a major differential here in our agency. Those who pay on time pays no interest rates. We are a small agency, but we understand the importance of small entrepreneurs for our economy. Ultimately, they are in a sector that has low access levels low access to credit by when they go to large banks. And our program is inspiring other states. I will show you some numbers. In our administration, in little more than 2 years, has financed 90.8% of the resources that were financed by the previous administration in 4 years. We have covered over 13,000 entrepreneurs with over 8 million reais, and we increased our resources last year during the pandemic. In 2019, we reached 18 million. In 2020, we reached over 6,000 entrepreneurs, covering or making available over 30 million reais. And in 2021, we have invested over 5 million reais, covering over 1,000 entrepreneurs. We work in partnership with several secretariats of our state, earmarking resources to family farming, solidarity economies, and youth, informal entrepreneurs, tourism, and we work with Sebrae to work on the fund to back small companies. So those who have come to us, we have facilitated their access, such as waiving some documents so that access to credit is streamlined. In these difficult times, in an unprecedented sanitary crisis, this is the guidance that we received from our governor, the governor of our state, so that we are close to the entrepreneurs and so that we can help them. So our agency, our small development agency, is here, and we understand the importance of small entrepreneurs to the economy of our state. So the number of jobs they generate as well. And ultimately, it is a sector that we know that has little credit access when they go to traditional banks because of their complexity and other reasons. So I repeat, here in Rio Grande do Norte, the state governor has commanded us to streamline the process so that we can reach those who need credit. The model of financing that we are adopting here is inspiring other states. Now we are going to show some numbers.
Já financiou 90,8% dos recursos que foram usados na gestão anterior, no período de 4 anos.
So, as I mentioned before, we have increased a lot the amount of financing. We have covered over 13,000 entrepreneurs with 52 million reais. We have increased our investments last year during the pandemic. We benefited over 5,000 entrepreneurs, investing 18.4 million reais, and in 2020, we increased to cover over 6,000 entrepreneurs, and we increased the value of investment from 18.4 million to 30.6 million reais. And from the beginning of 2021, we have invested 5.9 million reais, benefiting over 5,000 entrepreneurs. This is it.
A nossa AGN,
Our
ela, repito,
agency
sob a orientação da governadora, ela trabalha com ações multissetoriais
has been working with multi-sector
seja com a agricultura familiar,
in multi-sector approach.
with family farming, with entrepreneurial youths, with tourism, and in addition to the operation for supporting small and micro companies with SEBRAE. So we are seeking a path to help and facilitate for those who need credit. This is our duty, our mission. So at AGN, the word of order is debureaucratize, simplify, streamline. So to facilitate, I repeat, the credit access to those who need it. And so we have provided several mechanisms to facilitate this access. So the waiver of requirement of backers for requesting credit, and so to accelerate the whole process of credit and a specific online platform to cater to those who are seeking credit. And we also have our customer service through WhatsApp to improve communication and also to improve problem resolution. So after presenting all this experience to you, I'd like to conclude with a principle that guides our actions when we think about the future. The future doesn't start tomorrow. It starts and is built now, in the present, in the now. And it's increasingly urgent, therefore, that we collectively, society, government, entrepreneurs, should take on the commitment to build a more solidary community, economy that is more equitable. This is the path. It is only through this path that economic and social development will make sense. Thank you. I wish you all a very fruitful debate. Good morning to this sixth forum of development, and greetings to the president of the ABDE, Sérgio Guzmão, other ABDE leaders, representatives of all institutions that are part of the national development system at the federal and state level, representatives of international organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, the development system, national development system, no doubt has a key role in bringing our country to a different level of sustainable development, with a huge capacity to finance productive activities in several sectors and enabling long-term projects, decentralizing regionally the financing and supporting several public policies. Its capacity to identify and support projects with strong impact is key for the future agenda, with reduction of poverty and inequality, with greater inclusion and well-being for everyone. In face of the biggest health crisis and economic aftermath due to the restrictions imposed, these financial development institutions have an increasingly key role. Their action is very important in guaranteeing competitiveness and preventing the loss of jobs, and also in the post-pandemic recovery. In Rio Grande do Sul and in the south of the country, banks such as BNDES and Modesto have been played significant role. So significant amounts in financing contracts in order to foster sustainable development, strengthening the companies and cooperatives, in addition to supporting municipalities. Agribusiness, which is the strength in our region, remained as leader of the sector. Also, the Recupera Sul, the program connected to mitigation of the effects of the pandemic. The Inova BDMG, which is responsible for technology projects and sustainable production and consumption, financing important projects in renewable energy, energy efficiency, renewable use of water, low carbon agriculture, and solid waste. The national development system has the huge responsibility of making our country more competitive, more integrated globally, and more adherent to the best environmental, social, and governance practices. In Rio Grande do Sul, we work to mainstream this in all our actions. We want to walk hand in hand with the future, and also as a modern state, and the decisive contribution of the development banks. Public authorities need to do their part. We are going through a period when governments need to make responsible decisions without undermining the next few years. Fiscal responsibility agenda with realistic budgets and without juggling and prioritizing projects that have a future impact. It's what we've been doing in Rio Grande do Sul since the beginning of our management. We took on a state with the worst fiscal situation in Brazil, and we've been working from the beginning in a reform agenda with sound support of our legislative assembly. We have approved administrative and social security policies and guaranteeing a savings of over 18 billion reais until 2030. These reforms have been key for the resumption of payment of civil servants in the state after almost 5 years of delays in payments. And recently we approved the reform of the Social Security scheme for military personnel, more fiscally responsible than the federal government, with the potential of generating savings of up to 200 million reais a year. So these actions have been redesigning the fiscal scenario of the state. In little over 2 years, we approved a new environmental code. We have advanced in competitiveness discussions and also debureaucratization and digitalization of the government. We intend to conclude this year the concession of more than 1,000 kilometers of roads and recovering our road infrastructure. And we have reduced taxes during the pandemic. And so these are significant actions resulting from political actions focused on transforming the state. And this whole process did not occur due to unilateral imposition. It was always through dialogue and respect and clarity and negotiation. In the resolution of our conflicts and challenges, political and administrative challenges, I was, for instance, personally to the trade unions, entering dialogue with them so that all sectors involved could express their perspectives, respecting each one, even the opposition. All the discussions involved the state representatives, the representatives of the states, and we have always focused on the priorities of the state without inventing enemies, without wasting political energy in electoral distractions, without confusing the population with false discussions. Our next challenge will be the tax reform, which we began discussing last year. We've advanced with the approval of important alterations, but the discussion still requires more advances. And these advances have been delayed because of the turbulences brought about by the pandemic. We are going to do this year without waiting for advances in the national reform, which unfortunately is delayed. In addition to the tax reform, there's also the administrative reform with delays in privatizations that have not happened at the national level. These are very important measures for the country to have a clear signal of commitment with fiscal balance and with conditions to fulfill its commitments in the next few years, generating trust, reliability, attracting investment, generating income and jobs for the population. In addition, the development of the country requires addressing educational issues and environmental issues, not about protecting the planet only, but it's about aligning with the values of sustainability, which increasingly are key for our strategic partners with whom we are seeking investments in the country.
So respecting democracy, institutions, putting energy in what is actually important in order to transform the lives of citizens, and focusing not in conflicts. That's how we can go towards a future of more development in our Brazil. Thank you all for the invitation. So investing in the future of Brazil became even more important because of the crisis brought by the pandemic. We have future. What future do we want for Brazil? More sustainability, infrastructure, more jobs, more accessible financial instruments for broad development of the Brazilian economy. This future will be defined by the investments that we are planning now. That's why we need to discuss a greener, more inclusive economy. And this is, and we are here in the government of São Paulo, and we support this. I'd like to salute all authorities present in this such important meeting of the Brazilian Development Association. We all know of the importance of the economic activity in the lives of everyone, both state and private sectors, because the public sector depends on collection and the private sector depends on an environment that is favorable to investment and employment. Unfortunately, Brazil has been going or taking a path that it should not. We used to be the economy that grew the most in the world, but as of 1980, in the last 41 years, it has been one of the economies that grew the least. And even worse is that since 2010, in the last 11 years, we have had a decline in the income of inhabitants. That is, today, Brazilians are poorer than they used to be 11 years ago. And we cannot dissociate the economy from politics. Brazil retrocessed because of political problems. And what happened in the last 11 years? Impeachment, corruption, and several scandals. In 2015, 2016, I used to work in the private sector, and I saw the market of my company in few months reduce 30–40%. And I was obliged to dismiss a large amount of my staff. Brazil ends up being hostile to investment. Sometimes it is too good, sometimes it is too bad, And all this is brought about because of political problems. Unfortunately, we do not take steps. We lack reforms. In the last 40 years, very few were done, and they all were concentrated in the last 3 or 4 years. We had the labor reform in the Temer administration and the Social Security reform 2 years ago. Apart from those two that were more profound, very little was done in the last decades. We are in our Congress expecting the tax reform that is so important to provide greater security and to the productive sector. We don't only need the reduction of taxes. We want streamlining and security. When we pay our taxes, we never know whether we are paying it correctly. If we pay less, we're going to be penalized for that. If we pay more, we're going to have to go into justice, and God only knows when they're going to be reimbursed. Another reform that is very much necessary is the administrative reform. We need to have a more streamlined state that is more rational, that starts to wake up for its actual purpose, which is to provide services to citizens and not only look at itself, growing more and only focuses on itself. These reforms are essential, they are crucial, they are those that will bring about a fairer society with economic balance. And a good economic environment will bring more investment, and a more concise and streamlined state will not be a weight to society. I am optimistic regarding Brazil. Sometimes we have to go to a limit situation in order to carry out reforms. Maybe this is the case of Brazil. Well, we're still going through a challenging moment in the planet and in Brazil as well. Brazil is a place with a very large amount of variants that may pose risks to Brazil and other countries. And in this process, the lack of a coordination at the central level and planning has led us to serious problems in states. We had to work with our municipalities in order to do something and invite the private sector, academic communities, with some sectors of the federal government to work in the two lines. One, focusing on preventive measures and restrictive measures, and on the other side, there's our concern with our vaccination so that we can actually end the problem. And as of May, we will have more chance because we are going to have a larger amount of vaccines. And I work with governors, and we are dedicating efforts to reach around 70% of the population in Brazil having been vaccinated. And this brings important points, allowing for a chronogram, a schedule for the resumption of and recovery of the economy. As of the vaccination that we're going to have, is it going to be possible? Yes, that's the answer. And that's where we are working. We have here in the northeast of Brazil, we launched a program for the attraction of investments, public, private, for all size businesses. And With the federal government, we are trying to work towards resuming our working groups with the Minister Paulo Guedes and other ministers so that we can have a plan for development for the economy. The state of Piauí, my state, launched the Pro Piauí with an investment program with a portfolio of 4.5 billion reais in the area of infrastructure, roads, water supply, sanitation, health, education, and with a special focus on public-private partnerships in several areas: transportation, health, tourism, and other areas with large attraction.
Also, planning and a stimulus program targeting areas that with greater possibilities: renewable energy, agribusiness, infrastructure areas, with the possibility of private participation and investments in also in tourism, in trade, with the Trans-Northeastern Railway, placing hubs in development areas, with PPPs for airports such as in Parnaíba and Teresina, São Raimundo Nonato as well, alterations to attract integrated investments. And I'd like to point out also the focus on attracting investments from Brazil and from other countries. We need to generate trust. I believe that a first step needs to be taken on the part of the public authorities. So we are working. The rule is from receivables from states and municipalities and from the federal level, we can anticipate revenue reaching 300 billion reais for investments on the public side. And with the guaranteeing fund, I'd like to also point out the resources that the states might have in terms of credit lines that will use surplus resources from the financial system. And so we have a significant volume of resources combining with public and private investments in areas that Brazil offers big possibilities. So there are imports, exports, and so we need to formulate a plan. And so through the consortium of Northeast governors and the state of Piauí, we need a plan that is well organized to integrate municipalities, state, federal level, and the private sector, both at the national and international level. So we are going to tackle the post-COVID and guarantee income generation with support to entrepreneurs in our country. Hello, greetings to all of you who are participating in the 6th Development Forum of the ABDE. Special greetings to Rafael, director of the in the association, director of the Goiás Development Bank. We have also suffered the impact on our economy. Our big competitor enemy is the virus, an invisible enemy that has been affecting the whole world. But we were the first to act in our state. We quickly created the state, the recovery secretariat in our state, seeking to decrease the economic impacts of the pandemic. Several programs were created to ensure jobs, such as more jobs, more credit. And we have also been working towards regional development. The Manioc beer is an example. We promoted a public-private partnership for making beer from manioc that we purchased from family farmers. We also created the recovery caravan to study the potential of each region in the state and produce a diagnosis of the economic and social situation. So we will know what is most urgent, and we will better target the government's actions. Goiás Fomento was also very important so that the economy of Goiás would not suffer even greater impact. Last year, just to give you an idea, we provided 60 million and more than 600 companies in the tourist sector in the state, one of the most affected sectors by the pandemic. This credit line provides special conditions for working capital of these companies, where entrepreneurs have 60 months to pay the loans with very affordable interest rates and grace of up to 12 months for the beginning of payment and amortization. Last year, we also provided another emergency credit line for working capital for micro and small entrepreneurs. R$500,000 were made available for us to make for payment of taxes, of labor, and other fixed costs. This year, we provided more than 112 million at zero interest for loans at zero interest rates, also to help micro and small entrepreneurs during the difficulties imposed by the second wave of the pandemic. Beneficiaries have 6 months of grace and up to 36 months to pay the loans. No staff member, but there is a condition, no staff member should be dismissed. So this is just one of our programs to support entrepreneurs, facilitating access of entrepreneurs to credit lines and with much reduced bureaucracy. And proof that our actions are being successful is that in 2020, more than 26,000 companies were opened in Goiás. According to a survey by José, this is the highest figure of the last 5 years. Also helping our economy is our agribusiness, accounting for 66.6% of all exports in Goiás, just in the month of Goiás. So we are the third producer of grain in the country, according to CONAB data, with a highlight to maize and sorghum and soya. In stock raising, we are second in the country with a distinguishing feature. Here, agro is hand in hand with the environment, and we take this very seriously. Just to give you an idea, we've been working with a focus on green economy and taking into account our natural resources. We're talking about minerals, soil, vegetation, especially water. Since my administration began, we have firmly managed efficiently our water resources. In the beginning of my administration, in the first semester 2019, we launched the program Together for Araguaia in partnership with Governor Mauro Mendes of Mato Grosso, the biggest project for environmental recovery in the world. It's been advancing year by year, recovering the margins and the sources of the Araguaia in an area of over 10,000 hectares. In 2020, we began the construction of the Center for Forest Studies to produce cuttings that will be planted in a huge area in Goiás and in Mato Grosso. We have also made a revolution in environmental licensing. In Goiás, the process was very bureaucratic with many economic bottlenecks and little social promotion. The process has now been fully modernized thanks to the new environmental licensing law of Goiás, which is the most advanced in the country. In the last 20 years, it used to take up to 10 years to obtain a license in the state, but with the new law, the deadline has been reduced to a month for rural producers to obtain their license. This does not mean that Goiás is delivering licenses without any criteria. On the contrary, our Environment and Sustainable Development Secretariat has created the IP system,
not only eliminating bureaucracy in the issuance of licenses, but also it reduced the way the licenses are issued. Today we have productive chains involving local communities, such as the development of the two parks existing in the region, Terra Ronca and Águas do Paraíso. And we have now seen the reflections of our work. A research institution published the estimate of growth in Brazil of 2.2%, and in Goiás, we are going to grow 4.5%. The same will reduce for 2022. Brazil may grow 2.3%, and Goiás 3.5%. So we're going to be over the national projection. So I am convinced, and I know that the moment is not easy, but I have no doubts that we're going to recover the economy here in Goiás and even improve it. As I shown, we have all the resources for all this to happen. So thank you very much. My salute to all of you participating in the 6th Forum of Development. We do understand the problems at the national level and the paths for our country to be in a better place. We know that the pandemics of the coronavirus has highlighted aspects that are structural and have marked the history of our country, especially relating the increase of regional and social inequalities. We have a scenario that is very challenging because together with these structural aspects, there are other topics, other problems, such as the crisis in productive chains, a supply and demand crisis, as we can see with the problems in several sectors of the economy, tourism, etc. And there is economic disorganization. We have seen a growth in poverty, hunger, inflation that is quite concerning. We also have the problem of unemployment, lack of perspective in terms of occupation for millions of Brazilians. We need to see the perspectives, the right perspectives. A good line of thought that would lead to good deliberations may and should take into account international experiences. We just heard about the Biden plan, including strong presence of the President of the United States in the U.S. Congress, reinforcing that. The state is a planner, a regulator, a tutor, an organizer of the economic development. And this idea is being reinforced at the global level. A more progressive taxing system that is able to generate financing for public policy that are essential for the confrontation of inequalities. Fighting inequality is not just about social justice. It is justice, essential, but we need to understand that a country of our size cannot leave or cannot dissociate from its driving force of the economy. We know there are problems, shutdown, even a problem of shutdown in the financial execution. So we need to think about restructure the state and also how to finance it, as we can see now in the US. We also have a strong perspective presented by President Joe Biden, including the topic of the green economy. And we need to incorporate in the Brazilian environmental agenda the understanding that we do a lot regarding the environment and we need to do more, not only because of our international commitments, but especially because of the interests of our nation and our population. The LEAF initiative launched in this Leaders Summit is also important, but we have the Amazonian Fund, we have the payment for environmental services, we have so many other discussions so that we can have the transition to a green economy and a low carbon economy. Here in my state, we launched a program with 4 main axes to include sustainable production, infrastructure, and green infrastructure. And we would like to invite you all to dialogue, to have a dialogue towards a good development project that is fair and sustainable, so that we can turn the page and go towards union and togetherness for us to reach the essential objectives for our country and our population. Thank you.
Então, estamos de volta.
Thank you. We have just heard our governors and we would like to thank them for their participation.
I'd like to remind you all that the enrollments are open for the 8th edition of the ABDE IDB Award of Articles on Development, held by the Brazilian Development Association, ABDE, and by the IDB with support of the OCB system. The 2021 edition brings the novelty of the category diversity, general aspects and challenges for development. In addition, it will receive papers in 2 other traditional categories, development and debate, and OCB system, development and credit cooperativism. Please find the regulation on the website abde.org.br and enroll until the 7th of July. We will now continue with our program.
Muito bem, estamos chegando ao
We are
término, né,
now
do Fórum do Desenvolvimento da Associação
about to conclude or close to concluding the 6th Forum of Development of ABDE with the last session on the topic Challenges for Development Policies. So I'd like to invite the president of ABDE, the moderator of this debate, Sérgio Guzmão Suchodolski, also the president of the Latin American Association for Development, ALIDE, Carlos Linares, and also the representative, the deputy resident representative of UNDP in Brazil, Carlos Arboleda. Thank you, Adauto. I'd like to greet my friend and leader of development in Latin America, Carlos Linares, president of ALIDE, the Latin American Association of Financial Institutions for Development. I'd also like to greet our partner, Carlos Arboleda, deputy resident representative of the UNDP here in Brazil, a partner in several activities of ABDE, especially those related to the 2030 agenda with the 17 Sustainable Development Objectives, goals. So this is the last day of the forum, full of positive messages, all converging towards the main message: recovery from the COVID crisis requires more than ever that we tackle the transformations experienced by our society and drive them towards the development that we so much aspire to. We have heard in the past few days that the region of Latin America was one of the most impacted by the crisis, both in health terms and also economic terms. And if measures are not adopted, we might experience a new lost decade in our region. This warning makes us think how the several development institutions should act to avoid more damages and to enable the necessary course correction. The first need identified is for connections and networks at all levels, international, regional, and national. The pandemic has evidenced the links existing in our society, and it's up to us to strengthen the actions of our institutions through partnerships that will allow us to drive development. In addition, the COVID-19 crisis has also accelerated the process of digitalization, at the same time clarifying access inequalities. Several economic sectors are impacted by lack of access to technologies, undermining general productivity by reducing access to education or hindering the operation of companies or even the access to financial services. So to reduce this inequality and drive digitalization of the population should be considered key elements when thinking of solutions for the crisis in a sustainable and inclusive manner. Lastly, the guiding role of the 2030 agenda in the decade of action for implementation of the 17 SDGs and 169 targets by all member countries of the UN, and for recovery to be aimed at achieving a new form of development, respecting planetary limits and finite resources, considering simultaneously the essential social basis for all the population. The financial sector, especially financial development institutions, have a huge contribution in the financing and directing of the market towards more sustainable and inclusive economy. We heard throughout the event how regulators can support this transition through new risk models and incentives to the transparency of institutions. Highlight was given to the development institutions in this transition as public agents with a long-term view and deep knowledge of local needs and internal technical capacity and relationships. These institutions can A, help in the design of public policies that take into account local challenges, combining them with the agenda of necessary transformations. B, to operate in a counter-cyclical manner in tackling the crisis, which is a classic role of development banks. C, building partnerships that allow mobilization and targeting of necessary resources. D, structure new ways of operating beyond financing, direct financing, and building new financial mechanisms that will facilitate access of private investors or foreign investors, especially for strategic sectors such as sustainable infrastructure and also for micro, small, and medium companies. And lastly, support the structuring of new markets that require investments in risk capital in order to drive development in all regions of our country, and for financial development institutions to fulfill the mission of placing Brazil at the level of development that we all aspire to and need. In addition to a focus on these assumptions, we need to rely on the permanent support of local governments so that the national development system will increasingly take on the role of making Brazil a more competitive and productive and socially inclusive and environmentally responsible manner. And for this, we are seeking to format a national development project. This is the invitation and the message at the closing of this event that I would like to leave to all of you. We have just heard 8 important regional leaders, 8 governors from all the regions of Brazil, including the Amazon region, who have come to give their testimony and report on the actions of their states and their development institutions and the federal institutions that operate in their regions, and also talking about the relevance of programs implemented in the past few years, specifically in 2020. Along the event, we also heard how the institutions of the national development system have been working and how they are structuring themselves to support the present, but with an impact in the future, with a long-term view. ABDES is a partner in supporting these transformations and in designing new paths. The association believes that development institutions will play a central role in this new development and seeks to collaborate, helping them in the implementation of their mandates and also bringing new instruments and methodologies that will facilitate their operations and opening up horizons for the establishment of new partnerships and learning the best practices that are applied with efficiency and excellent results in other regions of the world, in Latin America, and that can be applied in each of the regions of our country.
So we reach the final panel of the 6th Development Forum. This panel will have 2 special guests. First, as I have saluted, Carlos Linares, the president of the Latin American Association of Development, ALIDE, and also president of COFIDE, the Bank of Development of Peru. Second, Mr. Arboleda, the Deputy President of the UNDP in Brazil. Thank you all for being with us here this morning. I'd like to mention the importance of the relationship of ABDE with UNDP and COFIDE so that we work together in the SDGs, providing materialization to the topics discussed during our forum. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Carlos Arboleda and to thank him for his being here to conclude our forum today. Many of the topics addressed by our forum have to do with the mandate of the UNDP. So we celebrate the partnership that we are building with such important institution. This collaboration is very relevant to strengthen the system of development here in Brazil and for fulfilling the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. So I'd like to invite Mr. Arboleda to speak to us. Carlos, the floor is yours. Well, thank you very much for participating in this final panel of our Forum of Development. Also, I'd like to salute my colleague Carlos Linhares, in addition to all of you who participate with us online to discuss such relevant topic. The challenge of development that we have ahead of us is huge. We need around $3.5 and $4.5 trillion in annual investments in the world for us to reach the SDGs, according to UNCTAD data. Considering we have around 1 trillion, we do understand that we have a gap of around $2.5 trillion. So we do need to mobilize capital towards this. The total assets is around $380 trillion. And 1% of this total would help us eliminate this financing gap. However, the global financial system still seeks to channel this towards the SDGs and sustainable investment. So this should be a priority for all. This is a priority for all of us here at the UN institutions. When we already have our colleague mention this such important information for us to close the financial gap inducing to development, especially in the context of pandemics we are at. So we need to improve financial support and that the financial sector can actually provide support. Here at UNDP, we are very much focused on this challenge. We have in Paris, together with OECD, we have launched the framework towards the SDGs so that we can have alignment with all the plans for the SDGs. So the World Development Banks and formalized a joint action, reinforcing the joint work to change their strategies, activities, and modalities of operation in order to support the advancement of SDGs. No doubt this is important towards the right path. In the Brazilian case, UNDP has also been taking steps to being close to the sector more and more. As UNDP, we recognize them as such important players in the recovery. So through innovation, we need to help increase access to credit with tools related to SDGs, as discussed here in this event. Second, to develop standards and targets for investment in sustainable infrastructure and other actions related to economic recovery. I am happy to see that our understanding is aligned with what was discussed in this forum, and that there is capacity in Brazil to go towards sustainable growth. And Brazil has one of the largest development banks in the world, as well as subnational institutions, and this can ensure the role of leadership of this sector in order to face the challenges that need to be faced by the country. So UNDP is working in partnership with ABDE, and in September last year, we signed a memorandum of understanding for our initiatives and actions. The first objective is to implement a methodology to map out the sector with the 2030 agenda, analyzing and giving visibility to social impact and economic impact related to financing activities. We are going to finish this work this year so that we can identify the contributions by the sector to this moment. To summarize, we believe that the main message of this event is that we need to change things. Make a change in investment, development, in sustainable development. And you all have the ability to do different and to innovate regarding the possibilities of investment and map out all the benefits of your financing and investment. And this will allow this sector to be the main player for us to change things and advance towards the 2030 agenda. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the excellent event. Thank you for the presence, for the attendance of Mr. Carlos Arboleda. I am sure that our partnership will be further in the next months. It is great to know that we can rely on your important institution and teams to work with us and improve the work of all development agencies associated to ABDE. Now, Mr. Carlos Linares, the president of the Latin American Association of Development Associations, ALIDE, which I am also part. I'd like to thank ALIDE for their support to our development forum, for the organization Development Integration in Latin America that happened on Tuesday, with several directors of multilateral and subnational banks in Latin America. And
high-level discussions on the opportunities for integrated development of the region, in also offering the Executive Secretary, Edgardo, in the role of moderator and speaker. It's important to highlight the contribution of the relationship between ABDE and ALIDE for the strengthening of networks of development institutions in Brazil and in the region, contributing to stimulate the closer connection between our country and the rest of Latin America. I'd like to recover the message of Martin Rama, head economist of the World Bank for Latin America and Caribbean, on the roundtable at the closing of the forum yesterday on the 29th of April. Martin Hama pointed out that the region suffered with the impacts of COVID-19 and the conditions for recovery are still uncertain. He also reminded that the crisis can be a major driver of transformation in the continent. We have several opportunities, such as generation of cleaner and cheaper energy, digitalization, areas of investment that can help greatly to increase productiveness of our region. In face of the severity of the crisis in Latin America and in support of the recovery, we need to be united and rely on strengthened institutions that exchange knowledge among themselves. In this sense, the relationship between ABDE and ALEGE has the fundamental role of placing our banks and development agencies in line with the best sustainable development financing practices in our region. In this spirit, we have built a cooperation agreement that will be signed at this closing table, an agreement contemplating a broad range of activities in the following areas: modernization of the actions of development agencies, support to increase productivity in the countries in the region of Latin America, including Brazil, pursuit of goals, of especially the 2030 goals, and synthesized by the SDGs and the 169 targets. Economic recovery, sustainable recovery, post-COVID-19. These thematic areas will be contemplated through joint activities between ABDE and ALEGE, with a highlight to the formulation of studies and research, organization of seminars and thematic meetings, development of capacity building and training of the staff of the respective associated institutions, exchange of experiences of development financing, and also engagement in activities implemented in the scope of our cooperation agreement, so that effectively they can come together, learn from each other, strengthen ties, find common solutions for the challenges of the countries and our region, and also help in the implementation and strengthening of the integration of Latin America, which is one of the missions stated by the Brazilian Constitution. I'd like to conclude by saying that one of the main messages of the Development Forum is the need to build and strengthen networks between development financial institutions in order to tackle common challenges and expansions that were referred to along this event. This agreement between ABDE and ALEGE contributes to bringing together Brazilian and Latin America development banks in a collaborative platform for exchange of experiences and construction of common strategies. I'd like to give the floor now to the president of ALEGE, Carlos Linares, for his comments on the agreement. You have the floor. Thank you very much for joining us today. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Sergio Guzmão. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to greet also Carlos Arboleda, as well, which has been so
Quiero agradecer también a la Asociación Brasilera de Desenvolvimiento, ABDE, presidente Guzmão, y como ya mencionó, nos acompaña en el Consejo de Directores.
As already mentioned, we have also, you know that ALEGE, along its institutional life, has been analyzing the concerns of all the region, likewise focusing on solutions and proposals to tackle these problems. Issues such as international trade and integration, investments, joint initiatives in the scope of Latin America have been promoted by ABDE and through development banks, because the creation of ABDE comes from the vision of integration, a strong vision of integration of Latin America in the 70s. And since then, our concern has been focused on solution of crises and how we are going to overcome the weaknesses of the region, improve competitiveness, and all these, also social inclusion through greater financial inclusion, the environmental crisis as well. And now we have the health crisis brought about by the pandemic. We have been observing with a lot of concern all these topics and discussions, and confirming everything that has already been said and discussed. And I'd like to highlight some points. The issue of investments, which is so important for our countries. They need to be based on inclusive development. We must join efforts with regional and multilateral institutions and all financial and non-financial institutions that are relevant in the social sphere in several countries in Latin America. The importance of development banks and agencies in helping overcome crises and also for the subnational and national governments, providing resources that are necessary to drive initiatives that were made stagnant by the health crisis. And so we see the importance of development institutions throughout the region, in the Caribbean as well. The need to strengthen these institutions is clear. I should also mention the development strategies of our countries with an emphasis on the 2030 agenda, and also the SDGs. Therefore, the development institutions need to contemplate strategies and actions to build and reach the SDGs. The economic and environmental and health crisis is an opportunity for us to increase the resilience of our economies and not leave anyone behind. On the environmental sphere, transport, renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable agriculture, among other areas where we have important expertise accumulated with the support of extra-regional banks and exchange of good practices among development institutions and members of ABDE. Regarding international trade, in addition to the importance of deepening interregional trade, there are markets with huge potential and other continents, that we must make the best of. And in the assembly in 2019, we focused on the relationship between markets that are adopting that are becoming more dynamic. And so there is high demand for the products that we produce. I'd also like to say that, or mention, the important contribution of regional organizations, which facilitated resources in the health sector, supporting the links and facilitating businesses and integration of value chains.
As well as regional organizations, together with development banks at the regional level and human development and infrastructure of cities to facilitate this integration, the diversity of programs and products in order to include and facilitate financial inclusion. We cannot think about regional integration. We don't have integration inside the countries. And this means integrating rural and urban centers, as well as the international inclusion. So development banks are the main vehicles of development, and they are essential for us to achieve such inclusion. I want to say that cooperation through ABDE and the institutions of development in Brazil have carried out some activities such as the first meeting of chief economists in the city of Belo Horizonte, and BDMG was the host, and we received this, repeated this meeting in Mexico, and we are expanding the partnership for development of subnational development entities. Many of them are also members of ABDE. Finally, I'd like to talk about the partnership with ABDE. It is great to renew the cooperation of our institutions in order to strengthen our development in financial institutions and support the economic growth of our countries. ABDE in Brazil and ABDE at the regional and Latin American Caribbean scope. So I'd like to thank you. And it was also brilliant to be here in this exchange of ideas, which were very important for our objectives, the objectives of our associations. We need technical support, technical study, exchange of information, capacity building, and this can be done in a smart manner in order to coordinate, and we can get together whenever we need to support our financial institutions. We can learn a lot from advancements in Brazil in terms of social project financing, and Brazil can also learn and benefit from regional initiatives. This allows for exchange and partnership to facilitate the interests and aspects in the interest of both associations. We also, in our agreement, explore the areas where we can be complementary towards the development of Brazil and the region. Regarding good practices in our agenda and ABDE, we are very pleased with this agreement, and you can rely on us to enjoy all areas of cooperation in development initiatives. Before I conclude, I'd like to invite you all to our meeting of our assembly on the 25th and 26th of May. We're going to address, in addition to crisis, continuity or change through the digital transformation of the banking systems in order to contribute to the productive development at the regional level, including women and their participation in the national GDP, as well as mechanisms towards green development after the pandemics. So we're going to discuss new challenges in the new era, new stage. I'd like to thank ABDE for the participation, for the invitation to participate with you and to renew this agreement that is so fruitful for all of us. Thank you. So I'd like to thank Mr. Linares' participation and to celebrate the agreement where we celebrate our partnership. So I'd like to share with you on my screen the document signed to celebrate our partnership, ABDE with ABDE. I'd like to thank ABDE for signing this agreement, for the participation of President Carlos Linares in this event. And now I will give the floor to Mr. Carlos Linares for his closing remarks in our forum. Thank you again. And as I mentioned in my presentation, we are very pleased to have signed this agreement between our institutions. And I'd like to congratulate ABDE for the organization of this forum with topics that are so important for our development institutions and for our countries. Also, it was great to hear all the experiences of Brazil, and I would like to say that our doors are already open to our Brazilian partners as well as all development institutions from Brazil. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in such an important event. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Carlos Linares, President of COFIDE from Peru, and also President of ABDE. I am pleased and I hope that our cooperation agreement is very fruitful. Now we are closing the forum, and it was a pleasure to count on your participation along the last 5 days.
Important thinking and discussions were generated for the future of the development system and entities, not only in Brazil, but Latin America, and all participants of all the regions in the world, from Europe, from Asia, and other regions of the Americas, as well as Africa. So on behalf of the 31 associates, members of ABDE, I'd like to thank the speakers who dedicated their time and shared their knowledge and practices with us in the 24 panels that comprised the 6th edition of the Development Forum. Special thanks to the several international and national partners of ABDE, such as ABDE, who sent representatives for the discussions. And special thanks to the technical staff of ABDE, which made this forum a reality with so many quality sessions. My sincere thanks. This event was an important step for us to strengthen even more the coordination of development institutions in Brazil in a network for promotion of sustainable development in Brazil, connected with our neighbors, with our region, with the rest of the world, with the good practices in order to expand our horizons and imagination and the repertoire of our toolkit for the promotion of development in our country. I'd like to give the floor and thank our Master of Ceremonies, who will give us final information and also conclude. Adauto, thank you very much. President, it's an honor to have conducted the activities along these 5 days. And so we arrive at the end of the 6th Forum of Development. We were together along 5 days. almost 1,000 people enrolled, or perhaps even more, participating in over 20 hours of programs. We had over 100 guests, experts and authorities. So once again, on behalf of ABDE and the National Development System, we'd like to thank all our guests who enriched the 5 days of discussions with their interventions and contributions related to Brazilian development, expanding the commitment of institutions that dedicate their efforts to this mission, strengthening these institutions so that the activities, the development activities at the national level, and especially the regional and local levels. This is something that requires permanent enhancement, and not only internal support, but external support is key for this, because the cause of sustainable development should not have borders. You can learn more about the work of ABDE through the official channels, and also the next edition of the Humus publication will cover this event. Thank you very much for honoring us with your audience and participation. It will be a pleasure to meet you again on the 7th Development Forum. Have an excellent afternoon, and we'll see you